world moves fast. Your workday? Even faster. Pitching products, drafting reports, analyzing data. Microsoft 365 Copilot is your AI assistant for work. Built into Word, Excel, PowerPoint, and other Microsoft 365 apps you use. Helping you quickly write, analyze, create, and summarize. So you can cut through clutter and clear a path to your best work. Learn more at Microsoft.com/M365 Copilot.
Does it ever feel like you're a marketing professional just
speaking into the void?
But with LinkedIn ads, you can know you're reaching the right decision makers, a network of 130 million of them, in fact. You can even target buyers by job title, industry, company, seniority, skills, and did I say job title? See how you can avoid the void and reach the right buyers with LinkedIn ads. Spend $250 on your first campaign and get a free $250 credit for the next one. Get started at linkedin.com/campaign. Terms and conditions apply.
Imagine a deer hanging in a garage in November. The back straps usually come out first. Those are the prized cuts. The tenderloins might get eaten the same night, with a little bit of celebration. And then the steaks get trimmed and wrapped, carefully labeled for the freezer, and after that, the burger pile begins to grow. But eventually, you reach the part that don't get the same attention. The shanks, the neck, the bones, a lot of tendons. Maybe they get ground up. Maybe they get tossed in a stew pile. Maybe they quietly disappear into a trim bucket or get fed to a dog. But for most of human history, those were not the afterthought parts of the animals. And in many cultures, they were, and still are, some of the most valuable parts. Today we're going to explore why. Because the way modern hunters talk about wild game usually centers on one idea: protein. Lean protein, clean protein, healthy protein, organic protein. But historically, people weren't hunting animals just for protein. They were hunting them for fat, they were hunting them for marrow, they were hunting for skin, for bones, for connective tissue, and for organs. Today, we're talking about what happens when you move beyond the modern protein mindset and rediscover the full value of the animal.
Join Justin Townsend and the Harvesting Nature crew as they explore the world of cooking wild fish and game while sharing recipes, tips, tricks, and lessons learned from their pursuit of wild food. We sure hope you ate before the show, 'cause you're gonna leave hungry. This is the Wild Fish and Game Podcast.
Welcome back to the Wild Fish and Game Podcast. I'm Justin Townsend, and I've got Adam Berkelmans here from the Great White North, as always.
Hey guys.
Today we're stepping back from species-specific cooking and talking about something bigger, about how we actually think about the animals we harvest. Because right now, protein's everywhere. Food marketing has become obsessed with it. And that mindset has started to shape how people think about wild food as well. But that wasn't always the way that we really looked at animals. Adam, when people talk about wild game today, protein's almost always the first thing they mention. But this wasn't the whole story. What is?
Yeah, that's right. Right now, protein is having a massive cultural movement. If you walk through a grocery store anywhere in the United States or Canada today, it feels like nearly every single product is advertising how much protein it contains. And then you got protein coffee, protein yogurt, protein cereal, snack bars, chips, even powders to stir into your drink. Everything is protein. And there are actually some real numbers behind that trend. According to the 2023 International Food Information Council Food and Health Survey, which is a bit of a mouthful, about 71% of Americans say they're actively trying to increase the amount of protein in their diet. But at the same time, Americans are already eating a lot of protein. USDA estimates the average adult in the United States consumes around 100 grams of protein per day, which is significantly higher than the recommended daily intake. So culturally, we've developed this idea that protein is the macronutrient that we need to chase, just like carbohydrates were the one we had to avoid and fats we had to avoid, and now protein we need more of. In nearly every case, it's been way more nuanced than that. You can't just break this down so simply. And when hunters specifically talk about wild game, we often frame it in the exact same way. Like venison is good lean protein, wild turkey is clean protein, fish is a healthy protein. And all of that is absolutely true. We're not saying it's not true at all. But historically, when people harvested animals, they weren't really primarily thinking about protein at all. They were thinking about the entire animal and what could be gleaned from that.
And when you look at traditional food cultures around the world, you start to see that idea is everywhere. Animals weren't divided into good cuts or secondary cuts. Everything had a value. Sometimes the parts we overlook today were actually considered the best parts. Adam, let's talk honestly for a minute. When most hunters process a deer, how much of the animal actually ends up being used in interesting ways?
Well, it's sometimes hard to say because I feel like sometimes we're in an echo chamber where we're talking to people like Hank Shaw and Larry White and Jesse Griffiths and all these people who really appreciate the whole animal. Even Sean Sherman, like a lot of the guests we've had on the podcast, a lot of the people we surround ourselves with online are like kind of share our thinking that the whole animal is just as important. But when I was every season I do like a butchering for a guiding service, like a deer outfitter. So I end up butchering a whole bunch of deer every year. And out of maybe 20, 30 people, 2 or 3 are interested in the random parts of the deer. Everyone else just wants like steak roast burger. Don't give me anything weird. Don't mess around with it. So if I'm taking that anecdotally, I would say that, only 1 in 10 hunters maybe is really interested in the whole animal, where most others are just interested in the leaner proteins. No shade here. We're just kind of discussing it. But if you look across different hunting cultures throughout history, the pattern becomes very clear, and it's a different pattern than what we see today with wild game. So like the Plains indigenous cultures prize bison marrow, hump fat. Arctic Inuit communities depended heavily on seal fat, whale blubber. All the way back in medieval Europe, daily meals were often pottages, which were basically long simmer stews, the cauldron that just boils forever, made with bones, connective tissues, grains and stuff. So it's just this really collagen-rich stew. Chinese cuisine developed entire categories of dishes centered around tendon, skin, and gelatin-rich broths. The Chinese really appreciate different textures than Westerners do, and a lot of the best interesting textures come from these different parts of the animal. If you think of like Vietnamese pho, Japanese ramen, they both rely on long simmering bones to extract collagen and gelatin, lots of flavor and nutrition. And in all of these food traditions, muscle meat was just one part of the animal, not necessarily the most important part. The bones, the connective tissue, the skin, they were all ingredients that turn food into something really rich and satisfying, which is pretty different today. There's another great historical example of this from French cooking. For centuries, classical French chefs consider stock to be the absolute foundation of cuisine. So anyone who knows Escoffier, he kind of did the French cooking Bible that a lot of chefs kind of ran off of for years and still do today. He's one of the most influential chefs in all history, you could say. He called stock the soul of cooking. And what is that stock made from? It's definitely not steaks. It's made out of bones and cartilage and knuckles and skin and all this stuff, tendons. And the gelatin-rich parts of the animal that release all this collagen when simmered slowly are the ones that were providing the soul of cooking. French chefs became obsessed with those parts because they understood something very clearly, that these ingredients create structure and richness in food that muscle meat alone just simply can't provide. Just lean muscle meat doesn't actually have that much flavor and doesn't have much else going on for it, despite being tasty.
There's also a fascinating historical example that really drives home how important fat and connective tissue were in hunters' diets. It's something sometimes called rabbit starvation. So rabbit starvation is one of those strange historical phenomena that really changes how you think about meat. So let's think about the early Arctic explorers and fur trappers who documented it repeatedly. If people survived on extremely lean meat, things like rabbits or very lean caribou muscle, they could actually become sick despite eating plenty of food. They were eating lots of calories, but almost all of those calories were coming from protein. And the human body can only process so much protein energy at once. You hear about a lot of people in the weight loss or weightlifting world, they're talking about like if you're trying to cut, like eat a lot of protein because your body takes so much energy to process it, you end up burning more calories in order just to digest your food. Sort of as a result of this, people would develop symptoms like fatigue and nausea and weakness. And this phenomenon was documented by explorer Ville Mio Stephenson, who spent years living in Inuit communities. Did I say that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think so.
Sweet. And what he observed was that indigenous northern cultures, they already understood the solution. Instead of looking at just the protein alone, they prioritized the fat, mainly seal fat. They consumed the marrow, and they consumed the organ meats, because all those parts balanced the diet. The fat wasn't optional. It was required for them. And it's very interesting because you see this kind of, you know, we've seen the shaping and documentation and evolution of a lot of cuisines across the world, right? And then when we talk about indigenous cuisines in North America, a lot of it gets passed down from like, you know, explorers or missionaries or all these things like that. And sometimes those people didn't always dive deep into the topics of why people ate the things they did at the time. They just wrote down like, you know, this village ate a bunch of catfish or whatever. But when we start to look at it from this lens too, like you kind of see that all over people diets were very localized, but they were also very shaped by the conditions in which they lived in. And I think, you know, throughout a lot of Europe and certain parts of Asia, as work changed, as civilization changed, as the environment itself was shaped and people moved around, like those diets changed too. And that got translated a lot when people came over to North America, which also shaped, and people realized like, oh, wait, what I was eating over there, I can't really eat here because it's a different place. So it's interesting when you start to put that together and realize like, wow, this probably existed and probably still exists. If you start to look at kind of indigenous cuisine holistically, you'll see that.
Get in the game with the college-branded Venmo debit card. Wreck your team with every tap and earn up to 5% cash back with Venmo Stash, a new rewards program from Venmo. No monthly fee, no minimum balance, just school pride and spending power. Get in the game and sign up for the Venmo debit card at venmo.com/collegecard. The Venmo MasterCard is issued by the Bancorp Bank N.A. Select schools available. Venmo Stash terms and exclusions apply at venmo.me/stash terms. Max $100 cash back per month.
Not sure how to tackle your taxes? Are you sweating the small print? You may be experiencing FOMO, the fear of messing up. The answer? Using TurboTax on Intuit Credit Karma. They help you get your biggest refund, and then we help you do more with it. With a personalized plan designed to help you hit your money goals. It's time to take your taxes to the max. Start filing today in the Credit Karma app.
But if you think about that deer again that I was talking about hanging in your garage and the way we disassembled all those cuts, it's actually going to be a really lean animal. Venison itself is famously lean. Deer, elk, pronghorn antelope, all those things. This means that historically hunters didn't just focus on the steaks because, listen, we haven't been only eating deer for the last 200 years or 250 years, 300 years, whatever. People have been eating deer and antelope and bison and elk and all these things for a long time on this continent. And they made sure to use all the parts, right? The marrow, the connective tissue, the organs, and the fat when it was available because it was essential.
Yeah, and that's where some of this stuff gets really interesting, particularly the connective tissues being used throughout an animal. It's collagen, which we talk about a lot, but it's very important in cooking. Collagen is the structural protein that's found in tendons, skin, cartilage, bones. You find it a lot in like feet, in heads, and kind of the more interesting parts like that, tails. When you cook collagen slowly with moisture, it breaks down into gelatin. And that gelatin, like we said in the past in a lot of our podcasts, that gelatin transforms food. It thickens broth, it adds richness and mouthfeel, creates that kind of silky, lip-smacking texture that people associate with great soups and sauces. Like if you think of homemade chicken noodle soup made by, or like a turkey soup after Thanksgiving, boiling all the bones and everything, compared to like a packet of Lipton's There's a big difference there, and that gelatin is part of that. And some of the most famous dishes in the whole world are built around this transformation. And I can see these dishes are very popular in the wild game world too. And people are kind of gravitating towards them without even realizing why. But think of like osobuco, pho, ramen, birria, oxtail soup, like these kind of things. Those dishes don't exist because of, lean protein. They exist because cooks learned how to transform collagen-rich cuts into something really incredible. And if you've ever tucked into like really well-made osobuco, you know what's going on. There's something way more going on than just the protein itself. In Chinese cuisine, there are entire dishes dedicated specifically to just tendon. You see that in some other Asian cuisines as well, like tendon in some Vietnamese pho. But braised tendon there is considered an absolute delicacy, and it's personally one of my favorite dishes. I love it. Historically, it was prized for its texture and richness. Like I said, Chinese really enjoy different textures. And that idea, valuing connective tissue, developed independently in multiple cultures around the world. Not just in China and not just in Asia. And that tells us something really important. People everywhere eventually discovered the same thing. Those parts of the animals produce some of the best food. I think you kind of mentioned it a little bit, but you can really see that in traditional cuisines where people are still cooking the way they did, hundreds of years ago. Even if it's modernizing a little bit, people who have kind of stayed in place for a long time tend to cook way more stuff with cartilage and skin and tendons and things where, Western culture, which kind of moved away from that, really leans more into the lean proteins and are often scared of that kind of stuff.
It's interesting, too, because I've seen it. You see it in places that have a contrast where colonialism has been present and then colonialism has subsided and, the population is still there. I think about like the Philippines or Jamaica or parts of that of, the Caribbean, the Pacific region, Africa, all these places. And historically, these cuts were probably still used, but you go to butchers from those areas and you order something and things are often not sliced, they're just chopped. You just have a whole hunk of meat and it's just like they just take it and just cut it up into big chunks and throw it into the pot or the stir fry or, the pan or the grill or whatever, and people consume things off the bone. But when they do that, they're breaking up those sections of bones and they're utilizing both the bones and the cartilage in those meals to add something beyond just the protein to the dish that they're creating. So, like curries or grilled meats or slow simmer stews or any of those things, those are pulling that cartilage out. They're pulling the marrow out. They're pulling all those things out, and that stuff's getting added into it. And, I know that not a lot of folks. I do know of people that have an aversion to eating meat off the bone, which is such a foreign concept to me. Not the eating things off the bone, but the reverse of not eating things off the bone, because, we understand that's where the flavor come from. As we sort of talk about history and we talked about cooking, there's even more, right? There's a nutritional side that I think we need to examine a little bit, right? Because people hear whole animal eating and they just think it's about thrift, right? It's about tradition. It's about using the whole animal. It's about doing the right thing. But nutritionally, all these parts are actually quite different from the straight muscle meat, right?
Yeah, I think that's where this conversation gets really interesting. Because if you compare muscle meat to things like skin, tendons, bones, marrow, fat, and offal, the things we've been talking about, you're not just looking at different textures, you're actually looking at kind of different nutrient packages. Each one carries its own nutrient load. So muscle meat is mostly what people already think about. You got high quality protein, iron, zinc, B vitamins, all that kind of stuff. But skin and connective tissue are rich in collagen, which has a very different amino acid profile. I'm going to try to pronounce some of this stuff. Glycine, proline, hydroxyproline, compared with regular muscle meat. So when you're eating just steak, you're not getting some of those amino acid profiles. Collagen isn't a complete protein in the same way meat and eggs are, but it does supply amino acids and peptides that are structurally important in connective tissues. So that's one thing you're missing with just straight lean meat. One thing the science is pretty clear on is this: when people consume collagen peptides, the strongest evidence is not for muscle gain, but for connective tissue related outcomes. So a systematic review found that the most consistent benefits were in joint function and reduced joint pain, while effects on muscle protein synthesis were much less impressive than high quality proteins. So that's basically saying that if you're focusing only on high quality protein, you're missing out on the nutrients that are going to help with your joint function and connective tissue related function. And that all plays a role together. You don't want to build a ton of muscle without rounding it out with the other stuff. You can do both. On the skin side, the literature is a little more positive than a lot of skeptics assume, but it's not magical, and there's no magical foods out there that are going to cure you of everything. Like, it's just, you got to take this all with a grain of salt, but it's just generally good for you. Reviews of randomized trials suggested that hydrolyzed collagen can produce modest improvements in skin hydration, elasticity, and wrinkle measures, usually over about 8 to 12 weeks. At the same time, those same reviews point out a lot of heterogeneity between studies, different collagen sources, different doses, and the fact that long-term outcomes are still unclear. Like I said, it's not a miracle claim at all, but there's science modestly backing that eating skin and some of this collagen, all this stuff can actually help with elasticity and reducing wrinkles, which I don't think anyone's going to complain about.
Well, and then you get into offal, right? And nutritionally, that's the whole different world. The liver, let's think about that for a second. It's one of the most nutrient-dense foods people can eat. A recent review notes that 100 grams of liver can provide extremely large amounts of vitamin A, iron, zinc, selenium, and B vitamins. And analytically derived offal data from the U.S. beef items showed these foods qualify as good or excellent source of multiple nutrients. Another one that may not be as popular, kidney. It's also very nutritionally significant. Reviews describe it as concentrated source of protein, vitamin B12, selenium, iron, copper, phosphorus, and zinc. And when people talk about marrow, it's easy to reduce it to just a fat, loose quotes, but marrow is nutritionally distinct too. Analytic nutrient work on beef offal includes marrow bones specifically, and the broader bone marrow nutrition reviews show marrow fat has a biologically active fatty acid profile and is tied into broader bone and fat metabolism. That doesn't mean marrow is a superfood in the trendy sense, but it does mean that it's more than just empty calories.
And it's stupid delicious.
Yeah, it's really, really good. Beyond just the old, the marrow, bone marrow drink everybody likes to consume. Like, it's much more versatile than that. And then also, like, let's shift a little bit. There's fish skin, which it's pretty relevant to people who fish, and a lot of us do. Fish skin is high in protein, and a large share of that protein is, in fact, collagen. And reviews on fish byproducts and fish skin gelatin note that fish skin is one of the major collagen-rich materials in the seafood world, which is interesting because it's actually the kind of thing modern cooks often remove or waste. So if you zoom out a bit to the modern protein conversation, it starts to really look kind of narrow, right? Because muscle meat matters, but skin, tendon, marrow, organs, bones, and even fish skin, all those bring different nutritional strengths to the table. And this is where I think the current hypothesis gets interesting. And I want to frame this carefully as a hypothesis, not a settled fact. Modern diets tend to emphasize a lot of muscle meat protein, which is relatively high in methionine. Collagen-rich foods bring more glycine-rich connective tissue, amino acids into the diet. There are researchers who argue that glycine may be relatively underconsumed in modern diets, and that higher glycine intake could matter for collagen synthesis and possibly other aspects of metabolism. One experimental paper even argues that glycine may be rate limiting for collagen synthesis in some contexts. But again, that's not the same thing as saying we've proven a perfect methionine to glycine ratio for human health. It's an interesting and biologically plausible line of inquiry, but it's not a finished conclusion. So the most responsible way to say this is, if you eat the whole animal, you're not just getting more protein. You're getting a broader range of proteins, fats, vitamins, minerals, and connective tissue nutrients. This is way more than you get from steaks and roast alone. And from both a culinary and nutritional perspective, that broader range may matter more than modern conversation usually admits.
Yeah, I think that's really the key point. What we're doing here isn't an argument against protein. Protein's important. Some specific diets for illnesses may need more of it. A lot of bodybuilders and athletes definitely benefit from more protein, even the average person. So this isn't an argument against protein. It's more of an argument against reducing wild food to protein alone. Because hunters and anglers already have access to all these other parts. We're sitting pretty kind of on this pile of awesome extracurricular kind of stuff on an animal that you often can't find in the grocery store these days. You got bones, shanks, skin, marrow, fish heads, organs, all this stuff. The real question becomes what happens when you actually start cooking with them.
And for hunters, this is where this whole idea becomes very practical, right? Because wild animals are really, as you've seen, perfectly suited for this kind of cooking. They're leaner than domesticated livestock, which means they contain more connective tissue and less fat. So modern cooking sometimes treats that as a disadvantage, right? We hear about, things are too dry. You have to be careful when you're cooking. But historically, that's what exactly cooks wanted. Think about venison shanks, goose legs, fish heads, boar neck, bear shoulder, trotters, and feet. Those cuts contain collagen that breaks down beautifully with slow cooking. And when you braise them, simmer them, or cook them low and slow, they become as the best food you can make. And those are exactly the parts of animals that many modern hunters overlook.
Exactly. And there's one extra point, I think, which is important, especially thinking about calories, is that lean steak or lean muscle, if you think of just like a big sirloin steak, like a honkin' plate-sized sirloin steak, I can tuck that away pretty easily, weirdly, for how much meat is there. It's crazy how much food is there. I can really continue eating it. But if I try to do the same with like a ossobuco or like a really hearty stew, I just can't do it. Like, I think by including a lot of this, all of these other parts, it can really increase you really get satiated much easier by including some of this other stuff. And if you're eating protein alone, I think you're going to end up being hungry a lot more often. So if you want like a really rich meal, you can eat a smaller amount of it and it will just keep you more full and keep you feeling better. And I think that you don't necessarily have to dish the steaks. Like, I think you can make a steak and then maybe do like a little bit of bone marrow melted on top, or, there's like a reduction demi-glace kind of sauce, which is made out of like veal bones and stuff, but you could do like a venison one, obviously. There's lots of ways to incorporate, maybe into a gravy or something, incorporate all these other parts into your dish, even if you are just going for like a nice steak. Because who am I kidding? Beautiful venison steak is something magical. It's not going to give you the same kind of homey, hearty feel as these other dishes we're talking about. But you can add those aspects back into it very easily. So that's something you should definitely be thinking of when you're building a meal and building your plate is, maybe not just a steak and some steamed green beans, but maybe a steak with a little bit of marrow brushed on it or a nice gravy with your potatoes, I
think one of the probably the easiest ways to incorporate a lot into it is we talk about sort of two paths of thought, right? One being that we need to pull all these cuts out separate from the meat, right? The liver, the kidney, the heart, all those. And there's the opportunity to consume them on their own as their own individual dishes, which there's plenty out there to do, right? There's plenty of recipes to do. We have tons of recipes for it. Our upcoming book has recipes for it, and you can go search through, domesticated versions of the same and utilize deer liver for beef liver and all the other things like that. But when it comes down to it, if you feel still a little squishy about that, about pulling those whole cuts out, I hate to say it and revert back to the grind pile, but I will. Like, it's an easy way to incorporate, to bring those nutrients back into it. I'm not saying pull all the sinewy collagen cuts up and grind them up with your ground meat, but I think like the liver, the heart, the kidneys, if you take those off and you clean them up, you can throw those in the grind. And guess what? Now you're adding more nutrients to your grind meat, and you're going to give it some more flavor. Sorry, birds were really loud. Beyond what you would normally just find out of just the meat alone. And I think it's an excellent way to utilize those pieces if you aren't quite yet comfortable enough to pull them out and cook them by themselves. So 2 paths of thought, squished into one, but I really think that what we're talking in this episode really is about using the whole animal and consuming the whole animal, and the reason why you should be consuming the whole animal. And I think that to do that from a nutritional standpoint, it doesn't really matter how you're consuming it. It just matters that you're consuming it because you're getting that balance from it.
Yeah, exactly. I think there's lots of opportunity if you're doing your own butchering, especially, which is just another reason to do your own butchering, to pull apart a lot of this stuff and set it aside for different applications. Like, you can kind of label your packages to suit that as well. Like, think if you're planning on having a little bit of grind for like something that's going to be more slowly cooked and stewed or sitting in a crock pot all day, you can actually grind up a lot of the silver skin and all that kind of other stuff that you normally peel off, as long as your grinder is, tough enough to take it. And if you're slow cooking that burger meat, it will actually break down the tendons and make it a lot more juicier and more rich. I wouldn't recommend that so much for fast fryer and just making a burger, but you can label it, set it aside. Something I've started doing too, I did an experiment where I butchered a whole deer, took all the silver skin and connective tissue and everything that normally went into the scrap pile, and I made a stock with just that. And it was the most gelatin-rich stock I've ever had in my life. It was delicious. So you can, like, that stuff, you don't even need the bones even to go with it, but it is better with bones. So if you're making a pile of bones on the side for making stock, throw all that connective tissue in there too. Throw the tendons, the big kind of yellow tendons that run along the spine next to your loin or backstrap, and then they go up into the neck. If you're removing that tough tendon because it needs to cook really slow for it to be edible, throw that into your pile too. You don't have to eat it. I like eating it. I like eating the Chinese way where you kind of braise it and it's like this weird, I don't know, it's like an impossible to describe texture that I just love. But if you're not into that, if that makes you a little icky, then just simply put it into your stock, boil or simmer all the nutrition out of it and all the good stuff out of it, and then use that in your cooking later on, and you'll still receive the benefits. So we're not asking everyone to start, gnawing on livers and tendons and stuff if that's not what you're into. If you are into it, cool. I'll leave the cut of your gym. But if you're not, there's still lots of ways to incorporate that into your daily cooking, and you'll receive some of that benefit. Yeah, it's not just about protein alone.
And I think right now everyone's chasing protein. That's like the big marketing thing. I almost feel that protein has replaced the organic food movement. Like organic food is commonplace now, and now everybody's like, oh, how much protein? But we as hunters, we have something much more interesting than just protein. We have access to the whole animal. And when you start using the bones, the connective tissue, the shanks, you start to rediscover something humans have understood for thousands of years. The best parts of the animals aren't always the easiest ones to cook, but they might be their most rewarding. And maybe unlocking the full value of wild game isn't about chasing more protein. Maybe it's about rediscovering parts of the animal that we've slowly forgotten.